If you have edges like this, but want edges like this, today I'm going to show you 4 common sharpening mistakes that beginners make when learning to sharpen their knives that could be holding you back from achieving the sharpest knife possible. Tip number 1, not a coarse enough starting grit and being too easy on the coarse grit. I'll explain what this means in a second. First and foremost, this is probably the most important tip here. This is where beginners always seem to struggle the most. When most people think of very high sharpness, they typically think of multiple very fine sharpening stones in order to achieve that sharpness. The knife that you saw in the beginning cutting all that stuff was sharpened on just one sharpening stone. The initial sharpness, or apex, is created on the coarsest grit stone. Now, if you're a beginner, I hate to say this, but your knives are probably a little bit duller than you think.
Please understand, I hold you in the highest respect.
Now, my grit recommendation for your initial stone is going to be anywhere from a 220 to a 320 grit stone. You can even go coarser than this if you like. Now, I will leave links to some of my stone recommendations down below, as well as some that I don't recommend just for comparison purposes. Now, a solid stone recommendation for me, which is the one that I use the most often, is the Sharpall 325 to 1200 grit stone. Now, at the time of this video, I am affiliated with Sharpall, but I still think that this is the best value stone for what you get. I will also list some alternatives down below as well if your budget is higher or lower. Now, the tip here is really where beginners can run into problems, myself included when I was first starting out, and this is stone timidness. Now, this is what a dull knife looks like under a microscope. Nasty. Now, if you think that you're just going to take your brick dot edge and gently lay it on the stone and make these nice, light, dainty passes on the stone and actually accomplish something, well, I hope you have a couple of days set aside, because that's how long it's going to take you to sharpen this knife. If you want to get it done quick, you have to add pressure. You have to add force into the stone. Do not be timid in this phase. You're using a nice coarse sharpening stone. You can use lots of pressure. You can push that knife into the stone and remove a lot of material here. Remember, this is hardened steel. You've got to add pressure in order for this abrasive to work properly. And with these nice coarse grit diamond stones, you can add lots of pressure and you're going to be okay. You're not going to ruin the stone. So set the knife on the stone, keep your wrist locked, and move your entire body back and forth across the stone while you're adding lots of pressure to the stone. How much pressure? I mean, don't be a gorilla and smash this thing into the stone. It's just unnecessary, but put some force into that. I don't know if you can see, but I'm putting quite a bit of force into this stone, and I can apex this brick dot edge in under a minute. So a lot of people have asked me to do this, so here it is. Basically, I'm pushing on the stone as hard as I would as if I was sharpening on the coarse side. And it looks like I'm adding anywhere between 4 to 5 pounds of force down through the knife. On the fine side, you can ease up a bit. Adding too much pressure on the fine side can wear out your stones faster with plated diamond stones because you have a smaller surface area for the diamonds to hold them in place. So on the fine side, it looks to be around 2 pounds of force. Again, you're going to have to get over your timidness, your fear of taking your nice pocket knife onto a sharpening stone and remove material. That's the only way that you're going to sharpen your knife. You have to remove material in order to form an apex. That's what makes it sharp. Tip number 2, not fully removing the burr. Now here's what that burr looks like under a microscope. You can actually see the small piece of steel hanging over the apex. Basically, this small piece, or burr, forms when the steel forms an exact point and the steel actually folds over itself, sort of like Play-Doh does when it's also smashed into an exact point. Now, once you've actually removed all of that material by not being afraid on the coarse grit stone and you form the burr, it's very important to remove this burr from your apex. Now, failing to remove this burr is the reason that you hear the myth that a super sharp knife dulls faster. That's absolutely not true. What's actually happening here is that the burr has not fully been removed from the apex, and the burr feels very sharp when you start cutting stuff, especially stuff that's slightly more challenging, like running the knife into a cutting board or hitting bone when processing game, etc. The burr will fold over fairly easily and make the knife feel dull very quickly. Now, to get the best, longest lasting apex possible, your main goal here is going to be to fully remove any burr. Now, this is accomplished in a couple of ways. Let me walk you through it. So I'm just going to show you a technique here real quick that's going to help you minimize and reduce that burr as much as possible. Now, this applies to whatever grit that you're finishing on. I'm going to demonstrate this on the 325 grit, but this applies to whatever grit that you are finishing your edge on. If you're finishing it on the 1200 grit, you would do this step on the 1200 grit, or a 2000 grit, or a 3000 or 5000, whatever grit it is, whatever your last grit is in your grit progression, this is what you're going to do this step on. Now, basically what I'm going to do here is after I fully form that burr and I can feel the burr with my finger all along the entire length of the knife, we're going to go back to the stone and we're going to apply the full amount of pressure that we were sharpening with. So let's say that we're using 5 pounds of pressure here, and we're going to run the knife along the stone in alternating passes, and as we are alternating, we're going to reduce our force that we're putting into the knife, which will in turn reduce the pressure the blade is feeling on the stone. We'll try and get our terminology correct here, but basically we're going to do alternating passes, reducing the amount of pressure that we're putting onto the stone. So I'm just lightening up as I go here. And what this will do is it will work this burr back and forth until it gets to the point where it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and hopefully the idea is that it breaks off, sort of like a paper clip bending back and forth. Eventually it will work hard, essentially it'll work harden and then break off. I'm going to show you a picture here real quick what this burr minimization actually does under the microscope. Now on the left you can see we started off with a large folded over burr. Now remember, this burr isn't always folded over and can be straightened, which will actually make the knife feel very sharp. But what you're actually feeling is the burr, not the apex. On the right is after our burr minimization passes. Already we've made the knife significantly better by exposing most of that clean apex. But if you look closely, you'll see that we still have some ragged edges right along the apex. This is where we move on to our next step and tip. Now, if you remember in our first step where we wanted to be aggressive, we wanted to remove a ton of material from the knife. In this step, it's pretty much the exact opposite. We want to be slightly gentle here. And the reason for this is because if we strop too aggressively, and by too aggressively, I mean adding too much force or pressure into the strop with a knife, what will actually end up happening is we can round over this nice apex with our softer abrasive strop surface. Now, how much pressure do you say is too much and how much is too little? Well, the problem is that it actually depends on your exact strop surface. If you're using leather, for instance, some leather will be slightly stiffer or more spongy. It'll have a different texture, different surface characteristics, and so I can't really give you an exact pressure to use on the knife blade simply due to the fact that I don't know what strop you're using. So what I recommend doing is placing the knife on the strop and using extremely light pressure to start out with. And by extremely light, I mean just the weight of the knife itself onto the strop. And your goal here is to hold the same exact angle that you sharpened at. And ideally, if you did your deburring process correctly, this will actually be enough to remove most of that burr. Now, if you find that you're still not removing the rest of that burr, if you still have some burr remaining on the apex of the knife, you can feel with your finger. A lot of times you can see that as you're stropping. You'll make a pass on the strop and you'll see an area on the surface of the strop, and I'll give you a demonstration here where the strop just seems like it's roughed up a touch. That right there is actually the burr scraping along the surface of the strop. And that means that you didn't actually do the deburring process correctly on your stone. So a lot of times you're going to have to go back to the stone and do more alternating passes. The idea here is that if you're stropping, you don't want to see any areas on the strop that are being roughed up from that burr dragging along the surface of the strop. Now, a problem that a lot of people will run into is they end up using too much force, putting too much pressure on the knife into the strop. And what this softer strop material will do, even with a very stiff leather, if you use too much force on the knife, that strop surface will actually round over the apex. This is an exaggerated drawing, but as you're stropping, that strop surface will actually roll over this apex here, and the abrasives will round over this apex, and you'll end up with a nice rounded over apex. This is not what we want. We want a nice, crisp, pointy apex. And this is the reason why you typically want to use light pressure on strops. Now, if your leather is very stiff, if it's not a very spongy surface, if it's hard to sort of dig your fingernail into, you can use more force, you can use more pressure, you can put more pressure from that knife blade into the strop, and you're less likely to round over this edge. But basically what the strop is doing is it's getting into all of those areas where the stone really couldn't get into and refining that very apex. We're not refining our scratch pattern. Our scratch pattern is going to remain about the same, but all we're doing is we are refining that apex with that original scratch pattern. Now here's our edge before we stropped, and here's our edge after. Now keep in mind, this is a very coarse 325 grit scratch pattern on quality steel. So hopefully you can see the slight change in how that apex looks after it's been refined properly on a strop. This is what gives us that nice fine bite of an apex that we're looking for. Now you may be wondering if this burr removal actually makes that much of a difference. Well, it does. And I'll leave a link to a video I did a while back showing just how much difference removing the burr actually makes in terms of edge retention on certain items. And let me tell you, it's a lot. So be sure to go check out that video. Now to demonstrate this here, I sharpened this knife to hair whittling sharp. Next, I'll put a lot of force onto the knife, which puts a lot of pressure from the knife blade into the strop. Now I had to use a lot of force here because my leather is very stiff, but after doing this, the knife is no longer hair whittling. The knife still feels very sharp though, but it's lost that bite that we're all looking for from that edge being slightly rounded over. Don't be afraid to play around with this pressure thing on the strop. Start with light pressure. If you don't see the results that you like, start adding pressure until you get to a point where you feel like your knife is actually getting duller more than it's getting sharper. And play around with that a little bit, varying between light and heavy pressure, and see what works best for the type of leather, the type of compound, and the type of steel that you're using. Tip number 4, blade quality matters. So this actually brings us to our last tip, which is the type of knife that you are sharpening matters. Now, if you're sharpening what we like to call gas station knives or low quality knives using, I don't want to say low quality steel because it's really hard to find low quality steel nowadays, more so low quality heat treatments, you are going to struggle. Because some of the hardest knives that I currently have to sharpen to very high levels are these cheap, usually stainless steel knives. Now the reason for this is both low steel hardness and something called retained austenite. Now I don't want to get into what retained austenite is in this video, but basically it makes getting a fine apex and burr removal super difficult. Essentially, you can sit there for hours working that burr back and forth, and it will never really break off. And sometimes, even when it does, it actually takes part of the apex with it. And you'll have to go back to the sharpening stone to fix it. So in other words, it's self-dulling. And if you're learning to sharpen on some of these lower quality knives, well, good luck to you. Now I had this same problem when I first started out, and it wasn't until I switched to practicing on some quality knives that I really started to get those quality edges I was looking for. Now it's actually really difficult to say what is or isn't a quality heat-treated knife. This knife right here is a good example of this. This is a $1 knife from the dollar store, and I have absolutely no problems getting a hair whittling edge on this knife. Meanwhile, this old timer right here, which was a much more expensive knife at the time, will not take a hair whittling edge no matter what I do. As a matter of fact, it just doesn't get super sharp, period. Now I suspect a very high amount of retained austenite in this blade, and that's the reason why it's very difficult to sharpen. Now the good news here is that a lot of manufacturers are paying more attention to their heat treatments nowadays, and I think that this issue is far less of an issue now than it was years ago. However, I think that this is still worth mentioning, especially when starting out, because it does pay to start practicing with a quality blade. Now, I will leave some links to some quality knives in the description that have great reputations for being easy to sharpen. This is just something to keep in mind if you find yourself struggling when you're first learning to sharpen.